The weapon that broke Japanese bunker doctrine wasn't the one they feared most, and it killed more Americans than enemies in its first year of combat. February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima. The smell of sulfur hangs thick in the air like the breath of hell itself. Volcanic ash cuts through Marine boot soles as they stumble across terrain that looks more like the surface of an alien planet than any battlefield on Earth. The temperature swings wildly from 90 degrees on the black sand surface to a bone-chilling 60 degrees, just 10 feet underground in the maze of tunnels the Japanese have carved from solid volcanic rock. For 8 months before the Americans arrived, General Tadamaki Kuribayashi had turned this 8-square-mile island into the most fortified position in human history. 11 miles of underground tunnels snake through the volcanic rock, connecting over 1,500 rooms carved by hand using Korean and Chinese forced labor. The sound of Japanese voices echoes through these tunnel systems, creating an eerie chorus that American Marines can hear but never locate. Every piece of high ground bristles with hidden firing positions, and every low area becomes a killing field designed with mathematical precision. The Japanese had learned painful lessons from their defeats at Guadalcanal and Saipan. No more banzai charges throwing away lives in futile frontal attacks. No more death before dishonor tactics that accomplished nothing except giving Americans easy targets. This time they would make every yard cost blood, and every bunker position would be a fortress that could operate independently for 3 months without resupply. Interlocking fields of fire covered every possible approach route, and multiple escape tunnels provided fallback positions when one area became untenable. American commanders had never faced anything like this defensive network. Traditional explosives bounced harmlessly off reinforced concrete walls 3 to 5 feet thick. Artillery barrages that should have pulverized enemy positions created impressive craters but left the underground bunkers completely intact. Infantry assaults that worked against conventional defensive positions met withering crossfire from positions that seemed to materialize from the rock itself, then vanish just as quickly. The numbers told a grim story that military censors kept from the American public. Casualty ratios favored the Japanese defenders by 10 to 1 in bunker assault operations. The average time required to clear a single fortified position stretched to 6 or 8 hours of continuous fighting. Ammunition expenditure rates exceeded supply capacity as American forces fired thousands of rounds to suppress positions that could be reoccupied within minutes of any assault ending. Private First Class Tommy Morrison from Detroit wrote in his diary that the volcanic glass seemed to cut through everything, including the soles of specially designed combat boots, within hours of landing. The constant sound of unseen enemies moving through tunnel systems created a psychological pressure that wore down even veteran Marines. Sleep became impossible, with Japanese voices seeming to come from directly beneath American positions during the night hours. Temperature extremes added another layer of misery to an already hellish situation. The black volcanic sand absorbed heat during the day, creating surface temperatures that could burn exposed skin through cloth uniforms. Underground positions provided relief from the heat, but created new problems as equipment condensation ruined weapons and communications gear. The sulfur smell from active volcanic vents mixed with the stench of death and burning fuel, creating an atmosphere that many veterans later described as their closest experience to actually visiting hell. Japanese bunker designs incorporated every lesson learned from 2 years of defensive warfare across the Pacific. Steel-reinforced firing ports provided protection while maintaining overlapping coverage of all approach routes. Ventilation systems allowed extended occupation without surface exposure. Supply caches contained enough food, water, and ammunition for 3-month autonomous operation. Emergency escape tunnels with multiple exit points meant that positions could be abandoned and reoccupied based on tactical requirements rather than fighting to the death in fixed locations. American intelligence had completely underestimated the scope and sophistication of Japanese defensive preparations. Aerial photography missed the underground connections between positions. Infantry patrols could map surface features but had no way to determine the full extent of tunnel networks. Conventional wisdom suggested that standard bunker busting techniques would prove effective, but reality showed these assumptions to be dangerously wrong. The defensive advantage created by natural terrain combined with 8 months of engineering work resulted in casualty rates approaching 90% for frontal assault attempts. Bunker density reached one fortified position every 100 yards across the most critical terrain features. Each position had been sited to provide mutual support with neighboring bunkers, creating kill zones that channeled attacking forces into predetermined locations. Marine and Army units found themselves facing a tactical puzzle that conventional weapons could not solve. Bazookas proved ineffective against reinforced concrete and volcanic rock construction. Rifle grenades lacked the penetrating power to reach defenders in deep positions. Even flamethrowers of the early war period had insufficient range and duration to clear large fortified positions effectively. Before we reveal the solution, what weapon would you have chosen to clear these underground fortresses? Comment your answer below, because the solution came from a weapon so terrifying that even American commanders questioned whether using it crossed moral lines that should never be crossed in warfare. The answer came from a weapon so terrifying that even American commanders questioned using it, but first we need to understand exactly what the Japanese had built and why their defensive doctrine seemed unbeatable. The evolution from banzai charges to defensive warfare represented a complete revolution in Japanese military thinking that caught American planners completely off guard. After devastating defeats at Guadalcanal and Saipan, Japanese military leaders realized that suicidal frontal attacks accomplished nothing except providing easy targets for American firepower. General Kurabayashi had studied American tactics extensively and understood that Japanese forces could never match American industrial capacity or firepower in offensive operations. The only chance for success lay in making every American advance so costly that public opinion would force a negotiated peace rather than continue the bloodbath. This defensive doctrine development took months of careful planning and represented lessons learned from every major Pacific battle. Instead of death before dishonor tactics that wasted trained soldiers, Japanese forces would now fight from prepared positions designed to maximize American casualties while preserving Japanese fighting strength. Defense in depth would replace glorious death as the primary tactical concept, and every position would be designed to fall back to secondary positions rather than fight to extinction. The construction methodology used Korean and Chinese forced labor working around the clock for 8 months before the American invasion. Volcanic rock provided natural advantages that military engineers had never encountered before. The rock was hard enough to stop artillery shells but soft enough to carve by hand using simple tools. Natural concealment came from the volcanic terrain that made positions virtually invisible until American forces came within grenade range. Japanese bunker design specifications reflected years of experience with American assault tactics. Reinforced concrete walls 3 to 5 feet thick could stop direct hits from naval artillery shells. Steel-reinforced firing ports provided protection while maintaining overlapping coverage that created kill zones covering every possible approach route. Ventilation systems allowed extended occupation without surface exposure that would reveal positions to American observers. Multiple exit strategies and interconnected positions meant that Japanese defenders could abandon one area and reappear in completely different locations within minutes. Supply caches contained enough food, water, and ammunition for 3-month autonomous operation without any external support. Emergency escape tunnels with multiple exit points provided fallback routes that kept defending forces mobile rather than trapped in fixed positions. The defensive capabilities built into these positions exceeded anything American forces had encountered in the Pacific War. Deflection angles were optimized for incoming artillery fire that would bounce harmlessly off angled concrete surfaces. Murder holes allowed grenades and small arms fire to target approaching infantry while providing complete protection for defenders. Communication tunnels connected positions, allowing coordination between defensive positions without surface exposure. Japanese soldier preparation focused on training manuals that emphasized rifle marksmanship and machine gun tactics for sweeping approach routes. Every defender trained extensively on grenade and mortar defense protocols designed to stop conventional infantry assaults. Psychological conditioning prepared soldiers for extended siege warfare rather than quick, decisive battles that characterized earlier Pacific fighting. The primary threat assessment developed by Japanese planners expected American forces to rely on TNT charges, bazookas, and rifle grenades for bunker assault operations. Planned countermeasures existed for each conventional weapon based on experience from previous battles. Water barriers could stop explosive charges from reaching concrete walls. Angled surfaces would deflect bazooka rounds and rifle grenades. Overlapping fields of fire would prevent close approaches necessary for effective use of conventional demolition charges. The major blind spot in Japanese defensive planning was the complete absence of training for liquid fire attacks. No military manual addressed flamethrower tactics because Japanese forces had never encountered these weapons in significant numbers during previous Pacific battles. Traditional fire attacks using conventional incendiary devices could be stopped with water or sand, but liquid fire presented tactical challenges that Japanese training had never addressed. American intelligence gaps made the defensive challenge even more difficult than it needed to be. Aerial photography could identify surface features but missed underground connections between defensive positions. Infantry patrols operating at night could map some tunnel entrances but had no way to determine the full scope of underground networks. Radio intercepts provided some information about Japanese defensive preparations but underestimated the scale and sophistication of the fortification effort. Conventional wisdom among American military planners suggested that standard bunker-busting techniques would prove effective against Japanese defensive positions. Artillery preparation was expected to neutralize most defensive positions before infantry assault operations began. Demolition teams would handle remaining bunkers using conventional explosive charges, and flamethrower units would provide support for clearing operations rather than serving as primary assault weapons. The reality of bunker density on Iwo Jima exceeded all American estimates by factors of 10 or more. One fortified position existed for every 100 yards of frontage across the most critical terrain features. Construction timeline analysis showed 8 months of continuous preparation work that created defensive networks more extensive than anything built during World War I trench warfare. The defensive advantage created by natural terrain combined with extensive engineering work resulted in casualty projections that shocked American planners when they became clear during the first days of fighting. Japanese defenders had created positions that could withstand direct hits from 14-inch naval artillery shells. Standard infantry weapons proved completely ineffective against reinforced concrete and volcanic rock construction. Even specialized demolition charges required close approach under fire that resulted in prohibitive casualty rates for attacking forces. But American military engineers had been quietly developing something the Japanese had never encountered in 2,000 years of warfare. A weapon so psychologically devastating that its mere appearance would change the tactical balance of Pacific fighting and force Japanese defenders to choose between burning alive or surrendering to an enemy they had been taught to fear more than death itself. But American military engineers had been quietly developing something the Japanese had never encountered in 2,000 years of warfare. The M2 flamethrower represented a breakthrough in both mechanical engineering and psychological warfare that would fundamentally change bunker assault tactics across the Pacific theater. Development began years earlier when American forces studied German innovations from World War I and realized that liquid fire could solve tactical problems that conventional explosives could not address. The origins traced back to German flamethrower units that terrorized Allied trenches during the previous war, but American engineers had learned from early design failures. The original M1 and M1A1 models used backpack designs that proved unreliable under combat conditions. Fuel leaks created fire hazards for operators, while mechanical failures left assault teams without their primary weapon at critical moments. The evolution to the M2 system addressed these problems through improved engineering and better understanding of combat requirements. Technical specifications for the M2 flamethrower reflected hard-learned lessons from early Pacific fighting. Fuel capacity of 4 to 5 gallons provided enough napalm mixture for extended combat operations without requiring frequent resupply under fire. Effective range of 20 to 25 yards allowed operators to engage bunker positions while remaining outside effective grenade throwing distance. Maximum range extended to 40 yards under ideal conditions, but accuracy decreased significantly beyond 25 yards. Continuous burn time of 8 to 10 seconds provided sufficient duration for clearing typical defensive positions. The fully loaded system weighed 68 pounds, requiring operators with above-average physical strength and endurance. This weight included fuel tank's ignition system, compressed nitrogen propellant, and protective equipment necessary for safe operation. Training requirements emphasized physical conditioning as much as technical proficiency because operators had to maneuver quickly while carrying the heavy system under combat conditions. The napalm chemistry breakthrough came from Harvard chemist Louis Fieser, who developed a thickening agent that transformed ordinary gasoline into a sticky burning gel. The composition used gasoline as a base mixed with aluminum naphthenate thickener that created adhesion properties, allowing the mixture to stick to vertical surfaces for extended burning periods. This adhesion meant that targets could not simply brush off the burning mixture like they could with conventional incendiary devices. Temperature reached 1800 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit and sustained burning for extended periods that made defensive positions uninhabitable even after the initial flame attack ended. The chemical formula could be mixed in field conditions using standard military equipment rather than requiring specialized manufacturing facilities. Cost comparisons showed dramatic advantages, with napalm costing $1 per gallon compared to $15 for equivalent artillery shells. Production scaling reached 10,000 gallons daily by 1945 as American industry adapted manufacturing processes for large-scale napalm production. Field mixing capability meant that combat units could prepare fresh napalm supplies without relying on long supply chains that might be interrupted by enemy action or logistical problems. The mechanical components of the M2 system used compressed nitrogen as propellant rather than relying on combustion pressure that had caused reliability problems in earlier designs. Dual fuel tanks provided redundancy and allowed quick disconnect capability for rapid refueling under combat conditions. The ignition system used magnesium-based pilot lights that remained lit throughout combat operations and provided reliable ignition even in humid Pacific conditions. Nozzle design incorporated variable stream width control that allowed operators to adjust flame patterns based on target requirements. Wide patterns could cover large areas quickly, while narrow streams provided precision for specific targets. The system could project flame in steady streams or short bursts depending on tactical requirements and fuel conservation needs. Operator equipment included asbestos suits for protection against heat and flame blowback, though these protective materials were later discovered to create serious health hazards for users. Special training requirements included 40-hour certification programs that covered mechanical operation safety procedures and tactical employment methods. Team tactics emphasized coordination with rifle protection because flamethrower operators became priority targets for enemy marksmen. The psychological impact design was as important as the mechanical engineering because military planners understood that terror value might exceed actual destructive capability. Visual effects included 25-foot flame projection that could be seen from considerable distances, creating panic among enemy forces before actual engagement began. Sound intimidation came from the distinctive whoosh and roar that became immediately recognizable to experienced combat veterans. Smoke and chemical smell created additional psychological pressure, as burning napalm produced thick black smoke with distinctive odors that penetrated defensive positions and warned occupants of approaching danger. The weapon was specifically designed to force surrender rather than kill because live prisoners provided intelligence value while dead enemies provided nothing except body counts. Deployment strategy integrated flamethrower teams into existing rifle company structures rather than creating separate specialized units. This integration allowed commanders to use flamethrower support as needed without reorganizing entire tactical formations. Specialized bunker assault formations developed during combat operations and incorporated lessons learned from early Pacific fighting. Close coordination with demolition teams created combined arms tactics that used flame attacks to force enemy evacuation followed by explosive charges to destroy abandoned positions permanently. Medical support included burn treatment specialists because flamethrower operations created unique casualty types that required specialized medical knowledge and equipment. Would you rather face a machine gun nest or a flamethrower team in close combat because the psychological factor alone changed everything about Pacific warfare? The mere sight of flamethrower teams approaching defensive positions created panic reactions that no amount of training or preparation could overcome. But when this weapon met Japanese bunkers for the first time, neither side was prepared for what happened next. The reality of flamethrower combat would prove far different from what either American planners or Japanese defenders expected when liquid fire finally came to the Pacific War. But when this weapon met Japanese bunkers for the first time, neither side was prepared for what happened next. The first combat deployment came during the Saipan operation in June 1944, when the 27th Infantry Division received orders to test the new M2 flamethrower system against Japanese cave positions that had stopped conventional assault tactics for 3 days straight. The setting presented every challenge that Pacific warfare could offer. Humidity reached 85% while temperatures climbed to 95 degrees, creating conditions that tested both equipment and human endurance. Japanese positions carved into cliff face caves and underground complexes provided natural protection that artillery and conventional explosives could not penetrate effectively. The terrain favored defenders who could observe American movements while remaining completely hidden until assault teams came within grenade range. The combat debut took place during a cave-clearing operation on Hill 500, where Japanese defenders had created an underground fortress that controlled the main supply route for advancing American forces. 3 bunker positions had stopped American advances for 6 hours of continuous fighting, while casualty rates climbed beyond acceptable levels for continued frontal assault operations. Private First Class Robert Henderson carried the M2 flamethrower during this first recorded combat use. At 19 years old, Henderson had grown up on an Iowa farm and possessed the physical strength necessary for operating the 68-pound weapon system under combat conditions. His training included 40 hours of technical instruction, but nothing had prepared him for the psychological impact of using liquid fire against human targets. The tactical sequence began with rifle teams providing covering fire while Henderson approached the primary bunker entrance under direct observation by Japanese defenders. Enemy voices became increasingly frantic as they recognized the distinctive shape of the flamethrower nozzle and realized what was about to happen. No training manual had prepared Japanese soldiers for defending against liquid fire attacks because they had never encountered these weapons in significant numbers during previous Pacific battles. Henderson later wrote in his diary that nothing in training had prepared him for the sound Japanese defenders made when they saw flame coming toward their position. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming as defenders who had fought courageously against conventional weapons suddenly faced a threat that offered no defense or escape options. A single 3-second burst of napalm cleared the entire bunker position as burning gel penetrated through firing ports and forced immediate evacuation of defensive positions that had withstood hours of conventional assault. The unexpected outcome was that 8 Japanese soldiers surrendered completely unharmed rather than fighting to the death as military doctrine required. Results from this first engagement exceeded all expectations as 3 bunker positions were neutralized in 20 minutes compared to 6-hour conventional assault operations that had failed repeatedly. The discovery that Japanese surrender rates increased by 400% when flamethrowers appeared on the battlefield created immediate interest among tactical commanders looking for ways to reduce American casualty rates. Henderson experienced severe psychological impact from operating the weapon system. His post-combat diary entries described nightmares about burning sounds and voices of enemy soldiers pleading for mercy before flame attacks began. Years later, Henderson said in interviews that the weapon saved American lives but cost him peaceful sleep for decades after the war ended. The ultimate test came during the Iwo Jima campaign from February through March 1945 when 243 flamethrower operators deployed against the most sophisticated defensive network in military history. This battle represented the peak effectiveness period for flamethrower tactics as American forces faced bunker warfare at its most extreme development. The statistical reality was sobering for flamethrower teams. Average life expectancy reached only 4.2 days for operators who became priority targets for Japanese marksmen. The 68-pound weapon system made rapid movement difficult while the distinctive silhouette identified flamethrower operators from considerable distances. Enemy snipers concentrated fire on these high-value targets, knowing that eliminating flamethrower support would force American forces back to costly conventional assault methods. Tactical innovation developed during combat operations as American forces learned to coordinate flamethrower attacks with demolition teams. The cook and seal technique used flame attacks to force enemy evacuation, followed immediately by explosive charges to destroy abandoned positions permanently. Underground tunnel clearing protocols were developed during active fighting as American forces adapted to Japanese defensive networks that exceeded all pre-invasion intelligence estimates. Marine Corporal James Mitchell kept detailed combat diary entries that provide insight into flamethrower effectiveness from an infantry perspective. Day 12 of the Iwo Jima campaign found his unit stopped by a bunker complex that had resisted 3 days of conventional assault attempts. The flamethrower team cleared the position in 15 minutes, but Mitchell noted that Japanese voices were screaming before any flame was actually fired. Mitchell observed that surrender rates increased by 600% when enemy forces could see flamethrower nozzles being positioned for attack. The psychological impact exceeded the actual destructive capability as Japanese defenders chose surrender over facing liquid fire even when defensive positions remained structurally intact. The harsh reality was that equipment operators like Eddie Martinez paid the ultimate price for tactical success. Martinez was shot while carrying fuel tanks during a bunker assault operation. The 60-pound target on his back made him an obvious priority for enemy marksmen who understood that eliminating flamethrower support would restore defensive advantages to Japanese positions. These stunning battlefield successes hid a darker reality that military censors kept from the American public. Equipment failure rates and friendly casualties from flamethrower operations created problems that official reports minimized or ignored completely, while emphasizing tactical victories that made headlines in American newspapers. These stunning battlefield successes hid a darker reality that military censors kept from the American public. The mechanical breakdown statistics told a story that contradicted the heroic narrative of flamethrower effectiveness that appeared in newspaper reports back home. 40% of M2 flamethrower systems experienced significant failures during the first month of Pacific deployment, creating tactical problems that commanders had not anticipated during training operations. Ignition system malfunctions occurred in 25% of combat attempts, leaving assault teams without their primary weapon at the moment when flamethrower support was most critically needed. The magnesium-based pilot lights that worked reliably during stateside testing proved vulnerable to Pacific humidity and salt air exposure that corroded electrical connections and fuel delivery systems. Fuel system leaks developed in 30% of units, creating dangerous situations where napalm could ignite unexpectedly and burn operators who had no protection against their own weapon systems. The compressed nitrogen pressure systems lost effectiveness after repeated use, with 50% reduction in range occurring after just 5 combat operations. This meant that flamethrower teams had to approach much closer to enemy positions, increasing exposure to defensive fire and reducing tactical advantages. Friendly fire incidents created casualties that official reports classified as combat losses rather than equipment failures. 12 documented cases involved operator burns from equipment malfunctions during combat operations. 3 cases resulted from fuel tank explosions when enemy fire penetrated nitrogen pressure systems, causing catastrophic failures that killed operators and nearby infantry support teams. 8 friendly casualties resulted from flame blowback in confined spaces where wind conditions or structural features redirected burning napalm toward American positions. These incidents occurred most frequently during tunnel clearing operations, where ventilation systems and underground air currents created unpredictable flame patterns that endangered friendly forces. Supply chain problems complicated flamethrower operations throughout the Pacific campaign. Napalm mixing required specialized personnel with chemistry training who were often unavailable when combat units needed fuel resupply most urgently. Fuel contamination from saltwater exposure rendered entire batches unusable, forcing units to operate with reduced capability during critical combat periods. Replacement parts for damaged equipment remained unavailable for 6 to 8 weeks due to limited manufacturing capacity and long supply lines from mainland United States to Pacific combat zones. Training replacement operators required 40-hour minimum programs that could not be conducted under combat conditions, meaning that flamethrower teams lost effectiveness as experienced operators became casualties. The myth versus reality analysis reveals significant differences between popular perception and actual combat effectiveness. The widespread belief that flamethrowers killed thousands of Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific Campaign lacks statistical support from military records and post-war analysis conducted by combat historians. Direct deaths from flamethrower attacks numbered fewer than 200 across the entire Pacific Campaign, according to detailed casualty studies completed after the war ended. The actual impact came from psychological effects that convinced Japanese defenders to surrender rather than face liquid fire attacks. This psychological surrender effect saved an estimated 2,000 American lives by reducing casualty rates during bunker assault operations. Japanese response patterns showed that fear factor exceeded actual destructive capability by ratios of 10 to 1 or higher. Defensive positions that could withstand direct artillery hits were abandoned immediately when flamethrower teams appeared within range. This reaction pattern occurred even when mechanical failures prevented flamethrower operation because Japanese defenders could not determine weapon status from their protected positions. Comparative lethality studies conducted after the war show that artillery shells caused over 300 Japanese deaths per 1,000 rounds fired. Flamethrowers caused only 15 deaths per 1,000 gallons of fuel used in combat operations. Small arms fire resulted in 450 deaths per 100,000 rounds expended. The conclusion was clear that flamethrower value came from terror rather than killing power. Financial analysis reveals interesting cost-benefit relationships that justified continued flamethrower development despite mechanical problems. Individual M2 flamethrower units cost $375 in 1945 currency values. Training costs per operator reached $1,200 including specialized equipment and extended instruction periods. Fuel costs averaged $1.50 per gallon for field mixed napalm. Medical treatment for flamethrower operators averaged $2,400 per casualty. Single artillery barrage operations cost $15,000 to $25,000 but achieved bunker clearance time reductions of only 20 to 30% compared to conventional infantry assault methods. Flamethrower operations achieved 85% average reduction in bunker clearance time while reducing American casualty rates by 60% during assault operations. American casualty reduction value exceeded $50,000 per life saved when calculated using contemporary military cost accounting methods. Net benefit analysis showed 400% return on investment despite equipment reliability problems and high operator casualty rates. Long-term strategic impact remained limited because the war ended before full tactical integration could be completed. Nuclear weapons development overshadowed conventional innovation as military planners focused on atomic warfare rather than continued infantry tactics development. Flamethrower tactics were largely abandoned during post-war military reorganization in favor of air power emphasis and mechanized warfare concepts. The Korean War provided limited testing opportunities for improved flamethrower systems, but different terrain and enemy tactics reduced effectiveness compared to Pacific bunker warfare. Vietnam War operations saw evolution to vehicle-mounted flamethrower systems, but these proved vulnerable to enemy anti-tank weapons and were eventually replaced by other specialized equipment. Modern military forces have largely replaced flamethrowers with thermobaric weapons that provide similar psychological impact without the logistical problems and safety hazards associated with liquid fuel systems. Contemporary urban warfare tactics still incorporate flame-based weapons, but these use different technology and deployment methods compared to World War II-era systems. The flamethrower did not win the Pacific War through mass destruction but through mass psychological impact. Japanese soldiers never expected liquid fire, but more importantly, they never expected to survive encountering it. The weapon's true power was not in killing enemies, but in convincing them that death was inevitable, making surrender seem like salvation. What do you think was more effective, the flamethrower's actual destructive power or its psychological impact? Drop your answer in the comments and subscribe.